And for the first time since the 2020 Galwan clashes, the defense ministers of India and China have held a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the SCO meeting that's happening in Delhi right now. India has sent a strong... India has sent a strong message to China during the first bilateral meeting of the defense ministers since the Galwan clash. A communique released from the Indian side said that Defense Minister Rajnath Singh categorically conveyed that development of relations between India and China is premised on prevalence of peace and tranquility on the borders. He also added that the issues of the LAC need to be resolved in accordance with existing bilateral agreements and commitments. He also reiterated that violation of existing agreements have eroded the entire basis of bilateral relations and that disengagement at the border will logically be followed by de-escalation. All right, let me now go across to our guest, G. Parthasarathy, former diplomat, and Aina Tangent, political affairs commentator, joining us live from Beijing. G. Parthasarathy, we've had 18 rounds of talks between the army commanders of the Northern Command, and then, of course, now we have the first ever meeting between the defense ministers after Galwan 2020. Will anything give? Because these two outstanding friction points, Demchok and Depsang, seem to be still unresolved.
Well, let me put it this way, that I've been dealing with these border issues with China and Arunachal since 1986. When they intruded, it took us years and a meeting with Deng Xiaoping before the issue was resolved. China will intrude. China is being aggressive on the Indian border into new areas. The way they did it in Ladakh earlier, they're doing it in Arunachal Pradesh now. In Ladakh, they've retained a bit of the areas, but the most they have left. We will hope to move towards that direction.
Why is that? What are they hoping to achieve by making these sort of pincer movements into forward areas? What is the game plan here? What is the strategy?
Well, there's one. One is tactical, which is to gain the best ground for you can. About a border you have had different views on. The second really is more important, is they don't to put India, they think, in its place. That they will not succeed.
Okay.
That I'm very clear of. In Ladakh, they had to withdraw from most areas. We've left them with some. But certainly they've not got anywhere near the lake. In the same way, in Arunachal, they came in and they went back. So this will be a continuing thing. I mean, as I said, in Sembrangchuk, it took the intervention of Deng Xiaoping to get things moving forward.
Okay.
And here, I think, let me be very clear. Xi Jinping in India and the world has a reputation of being expansionist, trying to bully smaller countries, take over borders, whether it's Philippines, whether it is Vietnam, right across the ocean. This is Chinese policy, has been expansionist. And we will also deal with it in a regional way, as we are doing within the Indian Ocean.
So let me ask Aina Tangent, it's not just India. China has had this sort of salami slicing, if you will, with Vietnam, with Japan, with South Korea, with other countries that it has maritime disputes with, Philippines, etc. So this is part of a copybook. This is part of a strategy by China to try and push its claims. If there is pushback, then so be it. If there is no pushback, then you get to claim those areas which historically have never been yours. So this is part of a well thought out strategy by China, including against India.
Well, I think Beijing would disagree with you. I don't think you can necessarily equate the South China Seas with the situation between India and China. That goes back to the colonial past. British bureaucrats deciding where lines were going to be. So quite frankly, this goes back to 62. The perception on Beijing's side is that it was India who was trying to be expansive at that point, and they were concerned, once again, that India might try to do something similar. This goes to this issue of trust, which has been broken. And unfortunately, it's very hard to mend. I don't expect military, defense people, generals, to be negotiating peace. That really is something for the Foreign Affairs Department, and ultimately would probably have to be Xi Jinping and Modi himself.
But Einar, the fundamental difference in the approach to the border question is India's position is it is China that tried to unilaterally change the status quo at the border. This was through the Galwan incident in 2020, as well as other incidents that have happened in 2020. So China needs to go back to the position that it existed before May of 2020. That's the Indian position. The Chinese position is, let's talk about all the other issues. Let's talk about trade. Let's talk about people to people. Let's not talk about this vexed issue of border until the other issues sort of move in full throttle, move in fifth gear. But these two positions are incompatible.
Well, yes. I mean, the two do talk at cross purposes, and part of that, I think, is cultural differences and perceptions. The Chinese say, well, if we can't agree about something, what's the point of talking about it? Let's talk about things we can agree on, try to build a system of trust. From the Indian side, they say, no, we can't talk about anything until we have defined this one issue. So in essence, from Beijing's point of view, India wants to define its issue with China over a few scraps of areas where very few people can live. So there's a mutual misunderstanding that goes back a long period of time. And as I said, from China's point of view, they'd like to build trust. It's just a question of how that can be done.
Okay, so let me go to Ambassador Parthasarathy. What could be the middle ground? What could be the quid pro quo here? Because there has been, and I'm sure this has been the case for a number of years now, probably even when you were in service, that the Chinese are looking at some kind of a quid pro quo. While they are happy to give away parts of Aksai Chin, which they claim they may not be as amenable to what they call Zangnan or southern Tibet in Arunachal Pradesh. How does India then walk that fine line?
Look, ultimately, I agree. It has to be resolved on the basis of discussions and dialogue. But the Chinese policies is you give and I take. It's not give and take. And the fact is, we have not been transgressing into areas they claim. They have been moving into areas we claim.
Okay.
So it's a one-sided route. And the fact of the matter is that it's been hard. We have been disadvantaged and slow. Our lines of communication were bad, but over the last 10 or 15 years, and now after Mr. Modi has come, there's definite improvement. So they tried to get a whole lot in Ladakh. They got very little of it, but they got some. And our point is there need not have been that some. So yes, I entirely agree. We have to sit down and talk. But let's not define boundaries, on a vague basis. There are clear basis, at the basis of landmarks, hilltops, and so on. It's on that basis you resolve it.
Okay. Einar Tandjen, one of the other problems is China has convinced itself that somehow India is in the America camp. It's part of the Quad. It's sort of ganging up with America and its allies to try and somehow contain China. But the fact of the matter is that, A, India is an Indo-Pacific player. Its concerns have not been addressed by China. And also we have seen through the course of this Ukraine war that India is not loath to taking a position that may not be in consonance with the Western world. You have seen through the course of the Russia-Ukraine war how India has taken a different position, oftentimes in a dissonant way, on oil purchases from Russia, on not condemning Russia or voting in favor of votes that condemn Russia. These are sort of nuances of Indian foreign policy which somehow China seems to, or at least tends to, overlook.
Well, I don't think China overlooks it. Quite frankly, India and Russia have a very long history. It was Russia who was supporting India, and a large part of your military comes from Russia. And quite frankly, Russian oil is a lot cheaper, and during these very difficult times, and India's dependence, like China's, on imported oil. It makes sense for them to do that. But this idea that India isn't ganging up on China, I don't think you can convince Beijing of that. You did join, the Quad. Funnily enough, you weren't invited to join AUKUS, which is kind of odd since many of the same players. The only difference is they're native speaking English, and India is not. But
you do understand that. Not just the Quad. I mean, Japan has its own issues with China in the East China Sea. Australia has its own issues with China in territorial waters that it claims as its own. Not just the Quad. There are half a dozen countries, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of whom have problems with the sort of high-handed behavior, if you will, of China in the last decade or so, claiming areas which you could argue were disputed, but suddenly China comes out of nowhere and says, oh, these are our own.
Well, it didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, this goes back to the beginning of China. I mean, when it was a republic under Sun Yat-sen, that's when these maps were actually created. Remember, China's position is echoed by Taiwan and all of the nations that you mentioned in the South China Seas. I don't know why we're talking about that right now, but they have issues with each other. They have cross-border relations, not just with one neighbor, but with 3 to 4. So this idea that this is somehow China versus the rest is nonsense.
Okay.
What happened is the U.S. started this all with its desire to extend its territorial waters 200 miles because of their unique position surrounded by large waters on both sides. That led to this whole UNCLOS, which the U.S. did not participate. They said they don't submit to the jurisdiction of any other higher power. Mm-hmm. So as a result, it's thrown the rest of the world into disarray. The cannon shot rule, which was 13 miles, is one way, and people have just tried to grab what they can.
Okay, I'll give Ambassador Parsad the final word. And none of this explains the kind of absolutely belligerent behavior that China has been exhibiting towards Taiwan. And I think, again, the question comes back to, China is obviously closely watching Russia-Ukraine. It has seen how a great power can be brought down to its knees against a much smaller enemy. The entire West will coalesce once again if China were to attack Taiwan. How may that change India's own responses? Because for now, India has taken this neither here nor there kind of a position on Taiwan. But how long can it continue to do that? Let's say, in the event of China attacking Taiwan, can India continue to sit on the sidelines?
Well, I think let's be very, very clear. There are 2 points I want to make. One is on Taiwan. Mm-hmm. On Taiwan, we recognize it as an integral part of China. The question is, the extent of our cooperation with Taiwan extends to far less than what the Europeans and the Southeast Asians do. So China has no cause for complaint. If it makes a little bit of noise here and there, so be it. But the level of our cooperation with China, with Taiwan, is that which everybody else has. It's economic, and I don't think China minds that. And I don't think China has raised the issue of Taiwan with us when it comes to any territorial part of it. And let me come back to our friend. Let me tell you that I was in Moscow in 1971. You are talking of our relations with the Chinese. China colluded with the US and Pakistan to prevent the liberation of Bangladesh, and the Soviet Union stood by us. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you should deal with history partially. It should be dealt with compositely.
Yep. Okay. All right. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Ambassador Parthasarathy and Naina Tangent, for joining us. We'll see how the story plays out and whether or not something substantial comes out of the meeting of the 2 defense ministers of India and China, the first time they've met since Galwan 2020. Meanwhile,